So my registered record for predicting spreads on ESPN.com is 82 and 65, good for 55.78%. It puts me in the 98th percentile on ESPN, but of course, that percentile is a little bit inflated just because true sharps aren't, registering their picks on ESPN, and in addition to that, I do get a lot of closing line value on that site. For bets that I've actually written up this year as either bettable or if I've bet it myself, my record is 26, 23, and 2, 53%. Of course, that's, different lines sometimes than what's on ESPN.com. I'm expecting that percentage to regress positively a little bit in the coming weeks. My record straight up predicting games, just the outcome of, just predicting the winner of any game, 98, 48, and 1. Good for over 67%. That puts me in the 92nd percentile on ESPN. I think the thing I've been most successful at this season is teasers. My teaser record is 13, 6, and 1, over 68% correctness rate. The 1 is basically a push. Some sportsbooks create a loss for you if it's a push. And my record on game totals is 11 and 7. Not a huge sample size of that yet. So before I get into week 11, I wanted to go back and recap week 10. Generally, it was a good week. The teaser legs worked out really well. Pittsburgh covered the 2 points, obviously won by quite a bit more than a field goal. The Giants, which sneakily has been a really good team to bet on this year, being pushed out, or maybe it's just betting against, their opponents in the NFC East, but the Giants, they took care of business. They won the game outright. I pushed them out to around plus 9.5 last week in a teaser. And the third combination of the teaser was the Bears, who I pushed out from plus 3.5 out to plus 9.5. The Bears are an interesting one because they didn't actually cover their original spread number, but they did cover the teaser after the move. So that one was fortunate, kind of stuck around there. The Bears' money line obviously did not hit. The Vikings won the game outright, but the Bears over-under before the season win total of 8.5 and 8. I was on the underside of that bet is looking more and more possible by the week, and now they're 5 and 5. In addition to that, New England winning outright against Baltimore was big from like a season total perspective. I laid off of that game, but Baltimore under 11.5 wins is starting to look very attainable, and I actually think Baltimore might be a sneaky team to miss the playoffs this year. As far as the teams that didn't work out last week, the two big ones were Seattle and Tennessee, both losing their games outright. Seattle obviously did not cover their number, and so I will get into both of those teams more in depth in the Week 11 slate of games. Okay, so for Week 11, there's 4 teams on bye: Buffalo, Chicago, the New York Giants, and San Francisco. Okay, so starting out with the Thursday night game, Arizona is at Seattle. And so Seattle has not covered for me in each of the past 2 weeks. They're looking like they're on the decline right now. I thought Russell Wilson played one of the worst games of his career in that game against the Rams last week. It's definitely the worst game I've seen him play in the last couple of years. That game just did not go Seattle's way. I got to give the Rams some credit. I've been fading the Rams a lot this year, but they've actually been pretty good. I just thought the turning point in that game was when Goff fumbled on his own 20-yard line and Seattle recovered it. And Seattle was, I think, down by, 1 score at that point. And Wilson on that, I thought it was a 2nd and short, might have been a 3rd and short. He was starting to kind of move in the pocket, could have ran for the first down very easily, but instead he threw it across his body into the end zone and it got intercepted. I just thought that was the Seahawks' chance to kind of, take control in that game, and they just failed to do so. But, ultimately with the Seahawks, they still have a winning record. They also still have a winning record against the spread, and, I'm going to live and die with Wilson as a player. I just think that he had a bad game, but it's not going to deter me too much from picking Wilson against the spread in future weeks. With all of that being said, though, this is a spot where I think Arizona is the move. And one other thing I wanted to point out here is that Pete Carroll has done a really bad job of coaching in the past few years. His defenses have been atrocious, and this year, the Seahawks have a historically bad defense. In previous years, it's been, questionable, below average. The offensive lines haven't been good for Wilson. I've been saying this for a while now, but Pete Carroll has been dragging Wilson down for the past several years. And I think that I'm at a point now where, I just don't know what Pete Carroll brings to the table anymore. I think that there's a legitimate chance that, there's a bunch of bizarre drafting that they do. There's a lot of moving picks around for players. It's starting to turn a little bit into the Houston situation where they're kind of wasting Deshaun Watson's talent. I'm starting to get that feeling from Seattle a little bit. And so I think Pete Carroll, in the future, maybe a sneaky guy to get fired. Not this year necessarily, but just in future seasons. I don't think his leash is quite as long as most people think, even though he is under contract for quite a bit longer than this season. And then in addition to that, I guess the last thing I'll mention about Carroll is that he's not a good decision maker on fourth downs. There was a fourth down in that Rams game where I think someone in the broadcast pointed it out that it was a good decision to go for it, and it absolutely was, and Pete Carroll did not do it. And I just think that, just seems like Pete Carroll doesn't play with a full deck. I don't know if he's getting a little older or something, but this team is atrocious outside of Wilson. I mean, this team would seriously be probably among the worst teams in the NFL if they even had a slightly below average quarterback, let alone someone as bad as their backup quarterback currently. But anyway, going to this Thursday night game, Arizona has been a really fun team this year. I think that Kyler Murray reminds me a lot of Luka Doncic from the NBA, where he's just he's on this upstart team that's got so much potential, and he's kind of a backdoor MVP candidate now. Before the season started, I talked about Arizona plus 180 to make the playoffs. I laid off of their over-under win total just because I thought that the market was giving them some credit that they hadn't quite earned yet. But again, the variance was there. And so plus 180 to make the playoffs looks like a good bet right now. Actually, before last week's game, I bet on Arizona plus 570 to win the NFC West. Is a little bit of a hedge because I have a lot riding on Seattle winning the NFC West. And so going into this game, I normally like to back Seattle, but at this point with how their defense is playing and how Arizona has just been so good offensively, I think I have to give the nod to Arizona. They're getting the hook there at plus 3.5 on a Thursday night. I think that this, obviously it's projecting to be a high-scoring game. The total 57.5. I'm not going to bet on the total, I don't think, but Arizona plus 3.5 getting that little hook. And, for me, it's a little bit of a hedge just because if Seattle happens to win and cover, that is good for the long-term outlook of the Seahawks. But, even independent of my hedging, I think that Arizona getting that 3-point cushion is a pretty good move for this week. Okay, so moving to the early slate of games on Sunday. The Eagles are at the Browns. The Browns are 3.5-point favorites at home. The total on this game is moved down to 45.5. So I'm just going to lay off of this game. I think that Baker Mayfield and Carson Wentz are two of the most disappointing quarterbacks in the NFL this year. I think Carson Wentz could legitimately be benched in the next couple of weeks for Jalen Hurts. I just don't really know how many more excuses people can make for him until he's actually just sitting on the bench, because he has been atrocious this year. It's been really bad, and there's really not that many excuses. The offensive line's not great. I think some of it should fall on Peterson, but again, Peterson was pretty good about, having Nick Foles as the quarterback, even in 2018 after some of the coordinators left. So I don't know. I think this is on Carson Wentz. He's holding the ball too long, not a good decision maker, not all that accurate. But on the flip side, the Browns are a tricky team to bet on as well. This is a game I'm just staying away from. So kind of an exciting game that I am looking to bet on. Atlanta is at New Orleans this week, and my man Jameis Winston is back in as a starting quarterback in the NFL now. So the Saints are favored by 5 at home. The total on this game started out at 51.5, and now it's down to 51. So usually my instinct about totals and spreads tends to be reflected in movement in the market. But this time it's the opposite. I thought that the over looked like a really good move here. I thought this line was actually a couple points short. So at 51, I'm actually going to lean over. I just feel like the only way this game doesn't go over is if Jameis Winston is playing like a completely different style of offense than what he was used to in Tampa Bay, which might be true. But again, the Saints, they must realize that throwing the ball downfield does hold some value. And so I just feel like with how many offensive weapons are in this game, Atlanta, despite their fluky bad start, has actually been better lately. And they still have a very good offense with Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, and Calvin Ridley. The Saints have Michael Thomas back and healthy. I think Emmanuel Sanders might be the one player on the Saints offense who gets the biggest bump in usage because of the switch from Brees to Winston. And, we might even see some Taysom Hill. On a side note, I think on ESPN.com, Taysom Hill is listed as a tight end in fantasy. I actually picked him up. If you're sick of guys like Robert Tonyan and Mike Gesicki and all this crap, I don't know, just throw in Taysom Hill. You might actually get a rushing touchdown. You might get a passing touchdown. I don't know. It's the Falcons D as well. So ultimately, I like the over in this game, and I'm also going to go with Atlanta +5. I actually kind of like that. I feel like back in the past few years when Tampa Bay and Atlanta would play each other, the games would typically be shootouts, and it would be almost like a coin flip as to who wins every time. So I think Winston going to keep both teams in the game as usual. Any given play could be a touchdown for either team. And I like Atlanta's offense to kind of hang around and make this game close. So Cincinnati's at Washington. The Washington team is 1.5 point favorites at home. The total on this game is 46.5. This is a game I'm staying away from. Joe Burrow has treated me well with covering spreads all season long. The team hasn't been all that successful. They're 2-6-1, but I do kind of like the way that Cincinnati's been covering, so I don't really want to bet against Cincinnati, but I think the Bengals are walking into a tough matchup here. I think Washington, just having such a good defensive line and generally a front seven, I think it's going to be rough because the Bengals' offensive line, I think, objectively, I'd have to say, probably the worst in the NFL, and I think that's a big reason why they've been blown out by Baltimore and Pittsburgh. Those are teams that have, the ability to exploit the Bengals' offensive line weakness, and I think Washington actually has a similar defensive structure to those teams. Now, on the flip side, Washington's offense is not good, but this is a game I'm generally just going to stay away from. So Detroit is at Carolina. There's no lineup for this one, so not really going to make a pick. There's questions about whether Bridgewater is going to play, and there's also questions about whether Stafford is going to play. I think that, if both guys are in, I think the Panthers maybe getting a W at home is kind of like a sneaky spot for them. I think that, Detroit for me is just still, like, I can't get over the fact that Patricia is the head coach there. Like, it's hard for me to bet on them. I do have over 6.5 wins for the Lions as a preseason bet, and I mean, I don't know. It looks like it's close to hitting, but it's probably going to come down to the very end. I might as well just hedge a little bit on a team in Carolina that I wasn't as high on going into the season. Pittsburgh is at Jacksonville. The Steelers are 10-point road favorites. Total on this game is 47.5. Yeah, this is a game I'm probably not going to recommend as a true bet. I think that, as a super contest play, I'll take the 10 points at home with Jacksonville, who I think has looked quietly decent, for the past couple of weeks. I feel like Doug Marrone has done a good job considering how bad the team is on paper. They played a good game against Houston 2 weeks ago. I thought that they looked reasonable against Green Bay this past week, kept the game closer than most people thought. The problem is that Luton, I don't think, looked all that great last week, and he's going to play a tough defense here in Pittsburgh. The Jaguars do get C.J. Henderson back, who I think is probably the best player on their defense. I just don't want to bet on this one just because Pittsburgh has so many great weapons that I think the Steelers, depending on kind of what version of Roethlisberger shows up, they could cover very large numbers, and they could be, pretty disappointing pretty easily. Okay, so now we're moving towards a game that I like here. Tennessee is at Baltimore. This line is Baltimore minus 6.5, and I think you can still get it at Baltimore or at 7 here. I like the Titans a lot in this game. I think that this is a spot where this could be the beginning of the downfall of Baltimore, and I don't like this matchup for the Ravens. I think that Tennessee is one of these teams that people don't really take as seriously because their defense isn't as good, and maybe people haven't completely opened up to the idea that Tannehill is a really good player, or at least like a solid quarterback who's in the same kind of tier as Lamar Jackson at this point. But the Titans have a really good passing offense. They do run the ball too frequently on early downs, but A.J. Brown and Corey Davis and Jonnu Smith, these guys are really solid, and I think that the Ravens are going to have a hard time kind of keeping up with them. The other thing about Tennessee, and we saw this in the playoff game last year, is when Tennessee upset Baltimore, the Titans have the ability to jump out to a lead early. They're one of the few teams that has a really solid passing attack that can jump out to a lead early, and we know that when Baltimore falls behind, they are buried. They are just buried. I think Lamar has been easily inferior to Tannehill this year. I think the Ravens' offense is bland. I don't like their receivers. I think Marquise Brown is decent. He could be like a good number 2 receiver. Outside of him, I don't think they have anybody. Mark Andrews is basically just like a, move the chains every now and then, like 7-yard catch over the middle type of guy. And I just don't really see this Baltimore team as a legitimate threat. I think they have a better chance of potentially missing the playoffs than actually winning a playoff game at this point. I just think their offense is so weak. It's one of the probably 6 or 7 worst offenses in the league right now. And the fact that they're favored by 6.5 at home, I mean, I think anybody who's backing Baltimore in this spot is probably they're probably doing it from the wrong reasoning. They're probably thinking, oh, Tennessee's defense sucks, which you're not wrong, but is Baltimore's defense really that much better? I'd rather take the better offense. And I actually think Tennessee, not only the 7 points you could potentially get at minus 120-ish, but the Tennessee money line, I think it's around plus 250 in some places. I think that holds a little bit of value as well. Tennessee did beat them last year. Okay, the final early game is New England at Houston. Patriots are 2-point road favorites. The total on the game is 48. I'm not going to bet on this game. I think that this is a sneaky letdown spot for the Patriots, who are coming off of a very impressive win against Baltimore. I just don't love betting against Deshaun Watson. With that being said, I do not like betting on the Texans either, so I'm just going to lay off this one. Okay, moving to the evening games. Speaking of letdown spots, Miami is 3-point favorites on the road in Denver. Total on the game is 45. So Miami is cruising right now. They're on a good winning streak. I think they're a legit good team. I think they are legitimately probably a top 10-ish team in the league. I mean, they're really solid. I think that you could make the case for Miami as like the 4th or 5th best team in the AFC right now. I like what I see from Tua. I think he's good. I think he's solid, but I'm not prepared to bet on this game for either side. I do, however, feel like for a super contest pick, I think Denver getting the 3 points at home is probably the move. I feel like at this moment, if you back Miami, you're basically buying Miami at the top of the market and you're selling Denver at the bottom of the market, which to me doesn't make enough sense for me to do. And I know that Drew Lock was really bad last week, but again, Denver's been a tricky team to figure out. I know that Drew Lock sucks, but this team is still 3-6 and they've won a couple games that they shouldn't have, and they've also, they've kind of hung around in a couple games that they probably shouldn't have earlier in the year as well. I think at this point, the Denver altitude is a bigger line mover than Drew Lock versus the backup in Denver, but again, I think that this is one of those games where I don't want to buy Miami at the top of the market. So I'm going to lay off and I'm going to say, it's a sneaky letdown spot for the Dolphins, I think, potentially. And if they don't get let down, if they do play really well, then I think that this is a good game to kind of look back on and say Miami is a legitimate threat to win maybe even the AFC East. The Jets are at the Chargers. The Chargers are 8.5-point favorites. The over-under is 47. So I'm not going to go anywhere near this game. I don't think you can ask Chargers to cover a number that big, and I don't think you can ask the Jets to cover a number that small. So I'm just going to stay away from this one. Kind of an interesting game here as one of the evening games. Green Bay is at Indianapolis. So this line has moved from Indianapolis at -1, and it jumped out to the Colts -2.5 at home. I see the total on this game is now at 51.5. That number has gone up. So this reminds me of 2 weeks ago when Baltimore was a 2-point favorite initially in Indianapolis, and I took the Ravens at that time. And I was really surprised to find out that I actually was going against the market because the market moved towards Indianapolis by the end of the week. The Colts were favored by 1 point, I think, against Baltimore. And so I didn't get a lot of closing line value on that one. But the Ravens ended up winning that game. And I think that this is kind of a similar spot, but I'm going to actually lay off of this game because I just sort of feel like if the Colts want to limit possessions and just play good defense, I feel like they could actually limit the level of dynamicness of the Packers offense. So this is a game I'm staying away from. I don't really like it when the market is kind of going in maybe the more counterintuitive direction. So I'll lay off of this one. I think it'll be an interesting game to watch just for a results perspective. Okay, final evening game. Dallas is at Minnesota. Vikings are 7.5-point favorites. Total on the game is 48. So this line actually started out at 8.5 in favor of Minnesota at home, and it's moved down to 7.5. So people are jumping on the Cowboys for whatever reason. Andy Dalton is, I think, going to be back for this game. I don't want to go anywhere near this game. I feel like Minnesota tends to beat up on bad teams, but at the same time, I don't like backing Kirk Cousins all that much against the spread. So this is kind of the battle of the primetime collapse quarterbacks, Andy Dalton and Kirk Cousins. So, luckily the game is at, 4:25 Eastern time. So, we'll see what happens. I think Dallas's roster is bad. I think that the Vikings could possibly win this game comfortably. I think if I had to pick a side, I would be favoring the Vikings. I just don't see how you can back Dallas at this point, but it's a game that I'm generally just laying off of. Okay, this is my favorite bet of the week. It's a Sunday night game. Kansas City's at the Las Vegas Raiders. So the Chiefs, I have seen, are 6.5-point favorites on the road this week. At some places it's at 7, but I love Kansas City in this spot. The total on this game, by the way, 56.5. Andy Reid is coming off of a bye. The Chiefs are on the road, but home field has been devalued because of the lack of fans this year. So I think this is a terrible spot to be backing the Raiders. I also think the Raiders, you are probably buying them at the top of the market right now, if you are buying them. And I'm going to be honest. I know that they beat the Saints, and I know that they beat the Chiefs earlier in the year. I feel like the Raiders on this little win streak that they're on right now is a little bit fluky. I thought they played kind of just a messy game against the Browns a few weeks ago. They really should have lost to the Chargers, but they kind of snuck out with a win. And most recently, I think that game against Denver was a lot more about Drew Lock just being bad than it was about the Raiders being good defensively. And, they've had some success offensively. They've been basically just using their running backs and tight ends mostly. Not a whole lot of usage from their receivers this year, but I think this is a big, big letdown spot for the Raiders. I think this could be a game where Kansas City comes out and kind of reminds everybody the hierarchy of the AFC West, that Kansas City is far and away the best team. And, Andy Reid probably wants to win this game. I mean, the Chiefs lost outright to the Raiders earlier in the year. I mean, that's kind of embarrassing. I think that this could be a game where it's like all systems go following a bye. Kansas City wants to, keep chugging along here for the stretch run. And on top of all of that, Kansas City is playing for the 1 seed. Pittsburgh and Kansas City, one of those two teams might win like 13 or 14 games and not get a bye. So Kansas City still has a lot to play for. Okay, moving to the Monday night game, the Rams are at Tampa Bay. The Buccaneers are favored by 3 at home. The total on this game is 47.5. I'm going to lean a little bit towards Tampa Bay. This number went down from 3.5 to 3. I think Tampa Bay is a better team than the Rams, and I still have questions about Jared Goff. I think that Tampa Bay's defense could have maybe a bounce back game here against the Rams. I think that Goff, if he's pressured enough, could turn it over a couple times. The Rams have been kind of solid this year across the board. I was fading them a lot earlier in the year. I talked about how they went 4-0 against the NFC East. They're clearly a better team than I initially thought, but I'm going to lean Tampa here, just being at home the Monday night. Tampa Bay is still very much, pushing for a division win. Obviously, the Rams are too, but I'm going to lean Tampa Bay here just for some matchup purposes.